There's way more demand for single family homes than there are homes.
It might take 40 offers to get to a deal right now. It just might. But if you're disciplined and you underwrite and you make sure not to compromise just to try and force a deal to get done, I think you'll still be able to find stuff. And then if and when conditions do improve, you'll be in such a better position because... Welcome back to our special podcast series, The 20-Minute Investor, where we bring you actionable nuggets and insights from our real estate investing journeys in bite-sized 20-minute episodes. I'm Aaron Amin. My wife and I built a portfolio of 8 cash-flowing rentals across 3 states while working full-time and raising a young family.
And I'm Nathan. I'm a husband, father, a tech executive who built a portfolio of cash-flowing rentals across 2 states from over 2,000 miles away.
Together, we co-founded the Remote Real Estate Academy, where we coach investors on how to build their own portfolios of cash-flowing rentals from anywhere in the world. Today, we're going to talk about one of the more commonly debated topics in real estate. Is the single-family long-term buy and hold strategy still viable in 2025? It's a loaded topic. Let's discuss. What do you think? Is it dead? Should we sell everything and move on?
Yes, it's dead.
Okay. Well,
we'll just leave it at that. 2-minute podcast instead of 20 minutes. And I guess it depends on how you look at it and what you're trying to do. I understand why saying that is relatively commonplace today. And if you look at it, I think from interest rates, can you get something to cash flow, all that stuff, much harder. But then there's also the other lens I look at this through is that if you just look at purely supply and demand, there's way more demand for single family homes than there are homes. So on the supply side, so that alone, basic economics, one could argue that quite the opposite. It's pretty far from being dead. It's just maybe more work to get something to pencil out, I guess, or to get the numbers that you're looking for. But no, is it harder? Yes. I would say it's harder than it was a few years ago because we've been in the game for a while now. Is it dead? I don't think so. Outside of the teaser answering yes. But what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think harder is definitely accurate. Dead, definitely not. Right? Just because you have to put in more reps and be more disciplined. And if you exercise discipline and you put in the reps and you focus a little more on the inputs, try not to get as emotionally attached, eventually you'll land on a deal. I mean, that same principle would be true in a market with 3% interest rates, but you might have a little more competition. I would argue that right now, a lot of people are losing confidence, losing faith, and getting out of the game. Or, for the people that are looking to be new entrants, there's less people that are rushing towards this right now. I would say there's good and bad. The bad is that interest rates have been high for a few years, and there's not really any indication in the near term, 6 to 12 months, that that's going to change. So what do? You adapt to the new reality. We always talk about, we have a couple tools we use for quick underwriting. And I think the biggest shift that people have to make is to, instead of anchoring to the list price, every house, every property that you look at, you have to come from the perspective of what's the max allowable offer that I can make for this to meet my goals, and just detach yourself from the fact that maybe it'll be offensive to whomever you make that offer to. But if you never make that offer, then quit complaining about it. It might take 40 offers to get to a deal right now. It just might. But if you're disciplined and you underwrite and you make sure not to compromise just to try and force a deal to get done, I think you'll still be able to find stuff. And then if and when conditions do improve, you'll be in such a better position because if you bought something that can pencil at 7.75% interest rate, then, obviously down the road, when you pay that down a little bit, property values appreciate a bit, and you go to refinance into maybe a more favorable rate, then, things could improve down the road.
Wow, 100%. Yeah, it's just more work. And I think it's Michael Zuber who said, you were talking about 40 offers before you get one. And I think Zuber said, and he's probably said this several times, but every no, it gets me closer to the yes. So you do 40 and maybe it'll be the 41st, but every time you get rejected, you're that much closer to the yes. So it's not a bad thing. And it's good practice.
Is learning to interpret. We've talked on this 20-minute series a few times about buy box and becoming a master of a specific area or zip code. You can only become a master by getting reps in, analyzing, and making offers. I think sometimes people's funnel stops before the actual making of the offer. People conceptualizing about this and learning about it and saying, oh, on paper in my little deal analyzer, I see a green light that I could make $200 if I bought it at this price, but there's no way they'll accept that price. So they just move on to the next property. You got to actually put the offer out despite how uncomfortable it may feel. And if you're not willing to do that, then yes, it will be a very challenging environment to find good deals right now.
Yeah, and we talked about this. For me, it was also a mindset change, whereas when we bought our primary residence, it's an emotional purchase because it's your home, your nest for you, your wife, your kids, all that stuff. It's absolutely not the case when you're buying a rental. You're looking at it purely from a very cold mathematical numbers perspective. It needs to work on, quote, paper to get the returns that you're looking for. And from that standpoint, it helped me at least just not worry about what the seller on the other side might think. It's here's what I can offer and here's what works for me to get the numbers I'm looking for. And if that doesn't work for the seller, then that's fine. So, okay, they say no and we move on to the next one.
And I think in most places right now, sellers don't have a ton of leverage, especially a lot of the people that enter our program or our orbit are kind of come from similar cloth of us, where we lived in high cost of living areas where we couldn't afford rentals in our own market. But if you take that type of income from those high cost of living areas and the savings that people gain in their high income jobs, and you translate it over into an Ohio or a Georgia or a Indiana, you can make those dollars stretch further. And what you might be able to do is, I know a lot of people love to leverage themselves to the gills, but if you put 35% down on a property, that might only be $50,000 to do that and get it into a good property. That mitigates the impact of that high interest rate, probably allows you to stabilize quicker and get into a more comfortable position with your cash flow. And then again, you have maybe an eye on the future that 4 or 5 years from now, you'll reevaluate. If interest rates improve and the value goes up, maybe you can refinance and pull some of that money out. So I know a lot of people like to leverage as much as they can, or they like to cycle their cash as quickly as they can. And I understand why, but we have to probably meet the market where it is. And again, as we've talked about 100 different times, and we will continue to talk about, make sure it's mapped to your long-term goals and objectives. So I think it's a case-by-case thing, but there are different ways to make things work in this market, and it's not always just based on your traditional offer with exact 20 to 25% down.
Yeah, and I think that remains true all the time. The markets, whether it's supply and demand, inventory of single-family homes, or interest rate, or loan environment, or whatever, you're never going to have 2 days or 2 periods of time where the whole of, quote, the market is going to be exactly the same. So you have to be flexible, nimble, and have a pretty comprehensive toolbox to be able to approach it and make it work regardless of what the environment's like. Maybe we're biased, I don't know.
Well, the operative word is long-term. Long-term buy and hold, right? Mm-hmm. Short-term buy and hold, where you could argue that you and I got lucky. We had some tailwinds behind when we started investing, and I would not argue that case, right? In some cases, I invested in Las Vegas 2017 to 2019, and they had a 40 to 50 to 70% in certain areas run up in property values during that time. That's not something I would ever bank on happening again, but we did benefit from that for sure. If you are doing this strategy, the idea is that it is long-term. And maybe you'll refinance somewhere down the road when your return on equity, which I'll explain that in a second, but when that gets low enough, depending on your strategy, you might make a decision that you want to access that equity and roll it into a future deal. But the idea is that things take 7, 10, 15 years to play out in order to be able to do that with this specific strategy. There are plenty of other strategies that move faster, but they all involve usually more risk, certainly more time, and in a lot of cases more skill too. So that's additional effort that you have to put into your personal development, your network, your systems, all that stuff. Whereas long-term buy and hold, which is what most of the people listening to this are focusing on, you really can get that to this 20-minute a day thing we always talk about.
100%. What's return on equity?
Yeah, so this is an interesting, when I talk about those Vegas houses, for example, we bought them and they appreciated quite a bit in a pretty short amount of time. So what happened is, even though these houses were cash flowing well, the amount of equity that we had trapped in those deals, if you kind of rerun, it's almost like rerunning a cash on cash analysis based on your equity position and say, okay, if I have $200,000 of equity in this property, but I'm only making $6,000 a year in net profit. When you divide that out, I'm not going to do the live math, even though that's probably easy. It's a low percentage. And when you originally bought that property, you probably ran it based on looking for a 10% or a 12% cash on cash. But when you rerun it under that lens, you say my $200,000 is parked and trapped in this property, and it's only generating in my case, the property we just sold, it had a less than 1% return on our equity. So we had a decision to make. Do we let that ride and just pay it off over the next, which would take another 20 years unless we accelerated our principal pay down, or do we either sell or refinance it, use that 200,000, cycle it out and put it into something else? So that's a decision a lot of people face. I'm sure, Nathan, like you've been slow and steady buying these properties, and we talk about the loan pay down accelerates over time, and the appreciation is usually slow and steady, especially in the markets that we choose. At some point, you'll have enough equity in those where it's like, okay, am I getting the best bang for that, or should I 1031 exchange it, or should I sell it, or whatever? So I'm curious, do you think of that the same way?
Yeah, so 100%. The short answer is yes, I do think about that the same way, and I look at that not every day, that would be way too often, but I look at it on a regular basis. But I think it goes back to, I think the original kind of question or prompt here is I look at that and I decide whether or not now is the right time to act on what I'm looking at. So maybe I do have a low return on equity or equity, quote, trapped in a property, which I don't like that term because it's still my equity and it's still something I could choose to do something with when I choose to do something with it. Back to optionality from the discussion we had. But if the current environment, we were just saying before, interest rates, inventory, all that stuff is conducive to me doing something with that equity, then yeah, I will absolutely pull the trigger and do something about it. But if it's not, it doesn't bother me that I might have a low return on equity. It's not something that keeps me up at night, but I do look at it to figure out when is the optimal time to act, either selling or refi or 1031 or whatever it is.
It's a really good point. There's actually no fundamental problem with having a lower return on equity, especially if your goal is to hold these things long term, because if the end goal is to have a few properties paid off, we talked about in a previous episode, you're using some of these for a college fund. Well, yep. If you refinance in year 6, then it's probably not going to serve that purpose. The whole idea is to pay it off in the 18 years or however the timeline you set up, yep, so that it can be a tool for that purpose. So every house is different, and also every phase of life is different. I think for us, part of what caused us to make a move, which we could probably do a whole episode on that, of why we've sold a couple of our rentals. Part of why we did that is because our personal circumstances changed, and the time horizon for some of our cash flow goals from real estate accelerated quite a bit. The game we were playing when we first started buying rentals, when we had no kids and had a very different lifestyle, that evolved over time. And so we're viewing it as, I always call it portfolio chess. We had 8 properties in 3 different markets with different levels of equity position in each one. And we had to use those pieces to try and rearrange to meet the goals that we have for the moment. And those goals have changed over time.
Yeah, goals change a lot, or they do change over time.
Yeah. So I know you and I are in pretty much agreement about the fact that it's not dead, but let's give a moment to acknowledge, what are some of the reasons that you think people are saying that other than clickbait?
I think it's part of what I started with saying at the top. It's when people just take a house on Zillow or whatever your favorite MLS tool is, look at its price, look at interest rates today, and look at rents today. You, quote, can't, doing air quotes here, make it work in terms of getting any sort of cash flow out of this, or even less so, whatever 8, 10, 12% return on investment that you're looking for. And I think that's the quick and easy it's the quick and easy excuse to give yourself a pass and say, oh, this real estate thing doesn't work. See, I looked at 3 properties on Zillow and it just doesn't work today. And I think that's where a lot of it is coming from, in my opinion.
I also think that if you wake up on a given day and you put your 20 minutes in and you look at 3 properties and they don't pencil out, you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay that you're not going to find a perfect deal every single day when you go to do the work. You calculate your offer price that you could pay, we talked about. You move the levers until they turn green meaning that they're going to hit your goals. But there are other reasons why those houses that you're looking at might not be good deals for you. They might not be in the right part of town, or you might discover something about the features of them. That's where pulling yourself out of the emotions of saying nothing works. I think I've heard it referred to as pencils down, this idea that there's no opportunity out there, when it's just a reframe, I think, that most people are needing.
And it's patience. I mean, one of the properties that meets our criteria that was listed, I got it in my inbox this morning. We looked at it, it popped up on MLS or Zillow a couple weeks ago, and looked at it. Doesn't work. Can't get our numbers. But literally this morning, I got the email from Zillow telling me there was a $23,000 price cut on that property. Now it becomes way more interesting. I mean, I'll analyze it later to see maybe now it works, though I doubt it. But that $23,000 price cut on the listing is probably an indication that the seller wants or needs to sell. I might go in with an even lower offer. That's what people have to pay close attention to, be patient, and which ultimately I think shows that, yeah, it's not dead, or it can not be dead.
And this is actually, I think, one of your superpowers. And I've known you for several years now, and I've seen you do this multiple times, but just paying attention to the same properties, right? As they sit on market and collect dust, or as they go off market and then they get listed, 6 months later for a lower price, just keeping a pulse on those, because you know that at some point you looked at it, and if all you do is just discard it and throw it aside, and you don't even think, well, maybe I'll at least set a star it on Zillow so that I get emailed when there's a status change or what have you. Add it to your little inventory tracker. If you've got a good system for that, then you can be there for it when it does circle around eventually. And there's several stories I've heard you tell where you waited 6-7 months and you bought something 30, 40, 50% below what it was listed for when it originally went up. So that's a 100%. Huge point for sure.
Yep. You got to be patient.
Yes, I know Nathan and I are the masters of telling all the boring fundamentals, but
exactly.
This is what worked for us. We would like to think that we're presenting a little bit of a contrarian view to all the clickbait that says, this is dead. Go flock all your attention over to this next big shiny thing. Yeah,
everybody should go do crypto.
Exactly. If you want a quick buck in either direction, if you want to quickly make or quickly lose money,
exactly.
There are plenty of riskier and more flashy ways to go about it, but in our minds, single-family rentals in 2025 are conclusively not dead.
Agreed.
And we'll wrap it there. If you have an opinion on this, we'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Come find us, and we will see you next time.
All right, cheers.
Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.